So on this video, I'm going to talk about some politically incorrect questions to ask a financial advisor. So which questions should you ask a financial advisor? And before doing that, go over to infuriated.com, especially if you're an expat or a high net worth individual, and see how I can help you. Now, that kind of leads me to my first point about questions to ask a financial advisor, because I think the first question you should ask, or one of the first questions, is what's your specialism? Because ultimately you want to deal with someone who's specialized in the area you're looking for help in. So for example, if you're an expat, dealing with somebody who's lived that life is very important. If you're a high net worth individual, probably dealing directly with an owner of a company who's also a high net worth individual and has gone through the process of opening company bank accounts and things like that is quite important. But beyond that, I've noticed something. A lot of the articles online, when you type into Google questions to ask a financial advisor, are very politically correct. What do I mean by that? They're coming from not only a very American-centric or Western-centric opinion about how financial services should be, in other words, US regulated onshore financial services, but beyond that, it's very generic and bland, and some of the things are very silly as well. So for example, if you look online, a lot of the online articles will say, is your financial advisor a fiduciary? Now, a fiduciary is somebody who legally has to put their own interest above your own, but that's a legal thing, and it can only be enforceable usually in one jurisdiction. If you're a US financial advisor giving advice to US clients, then it's easy to be a fiduciary. If you're a financial advisor of over 100 different client nationalities and over 100 locations, then it's much harder, almost impossible actually, to be a fiduciary, at least legally. You might sign a fiduciary agreement, but that kind of brings me on to the next point, and that's then what kind of questions should you ask a financial advisor? And some of these are not necessarily seen as politically correct, but these questions would actually be much better than a lot of the questions that you see online about the questions to ask financial advisors. So beyond the question about specialisms and things like that, I think a good question to ask also is, what are you doing with your own finances? It might be a bit blunt to ask somebody, are you wealthy yourself? But it's not a bad question to ask people beyond a certain age. If you're dealing with a financial advisor who is 23 or 24 or 25, then that's one thing. But if you're dealing with an advisor who is late 20s, 30s, 40s or beyond, you don't need to ask, what's your net worth? But I think it is a good question to ask, well, are you practicing what you preach? Are you yourself wealthy? It's a bit like when I go to see a doctor, I'm always put off if the doctor clearly smokes or is massively overweight or shows signs that they drink too much, because ultimately I do know rationally that the doctor is still knowledgeable, but I like somebody who practices what they preach. And it's something I spoke about before on the channel and also on my website. I feel like I myself and those in my team in general practice what we preach in terms of we do save and invest and so on and so forth. So I think that's a key one. I think another thing is, does the advisor look outside the box? How can they see outside the box or look out of the box? Because one of the biggest issues you'll face with a lot of financial advisors is they're perfectly good people, they can offer good solutions a lot of the time, but a lot of them get into this groupthink. I spoke about that on one of my Forbes articles recently about how in financial services, people get into this kind of groupthink. So for example, in 2018, when I went online, completely online, people thought it was crazy to go online and focus on a personal brand. Obviously no one says that now, but at the time people thought it was crazy. It was just groupthink, where people all have these self-reinforcing conversations, a bit like in the UK we call it the Westminster bubble, where people in politics, they all speak the same language. And it's very much the same when it comes to financial services. A lot of advisors, they'll just say things like diversification or regulation, or they'll just come out with these terms. I'm not saying all these terms are wrong, but they'll come out with terms without thinking about it correctly. And the reason that matters sometimes is it can lead to missed opportunities. I'll give you an example. Within my client bank, the products and services that have the highest client satisfaction are actually the less regulated options. Now, of course, higher net wealth individuals are more likely to want to put a portion of their assets into private equity, private debt, and so on and so forth. So for example, some of my clients did the London Tunnels investments. On Google, you'll see that now it's done an IPO, or it's going to do an IPO on the London Stock Exchange. Now that was a completely unregulated, pretty much investment, but people are set to make a lot of money potentially from that. So the point is, when advisors bang on about regulation and things like that, often they're actually not going to offer you some investment options that might actually be beneficial for a portion of your assets. So I would look for people who don't just speak like people in the Westminster bubble. Look for people who can actually go beyond the ordinary. I think beyond that, asking any advisor or company, have you been featured in the media, is a key thing. So for us, we're lucky, we've been featured on CNN, CNBC, I write regularly for Forbes and so many other publications. And I think in the world we live in today, that's key because ultimately that matters much more than having 3 names after, or 3 letters, should I say, after your name. Again, going back to the Westminster bubble thing, a lot of advisors think some professional qualification is going to be such a big deal. For me, on LinkedIn and beyond, I don't even mention, or I might mention it briefly, but not after my name. I don't even mention my qualifications because it doesn't matter. Most people don't think it matters actually. Just saying, where you've been featured and those kind of things is much more important to the vast majority of people in this day and age. Not that I did a qualification 3 or 4 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever. They might want to mention it, but it's not that important. So I would say when you're looking to hire a financial advisor, I'm not saying some of those basic questions aren't important. Some of those articles make some really good points about some basic questions you should ask an advisor. But in general, an advisor that can see or kind of offer you options that aren't available to the general public, and they've been featured across media and things like that, in this day and age is much more important than some generic, 10 questions to ask a financial advisor.
Anyways, I'm very, very pleased and positive to say that I believe I've picked the right one. The results in the last couple of years have overreached my expectations by far. And I see no reason why it should not continue. Of course, I can highly recommend him as your financial advisor for now and for the future, because hesitating is missing out.
Obviously, the best result in market right now is Adam.